so I decided to seize it and make a start to our proceedings today. So, welcome. My name is Paul Bradshaw. I'm Director of the Scottish Centre for Social Research. I'm going to be chairing us through events this afternoon, trying to keep us on time and so on. But before we make a start, I just wanted to say a few words, because this is quite a significant milestone for us at ScotCen, marking 25 years of the Scottish Social Attitude Survey. In marking those 25 years, that means that SSA has been robustly recording public opinion in Scotland since the Scottish Parliament opened its doors for the first time in July 1999. Now, I know you're doing the maths in your head and you're thinking, that's 26 years. But although we collected the data in 1999, we didn't publish it until the year 2000. So, to keep in line with that, we're celebrating 25 years now rather than last year. Plus, we celebrated 25 years of something else last year. Some of you might have been at that one. ScotCen first launched this random probability survey back in 1999, and we've run a survey almost every year since then. And alongside NatCen's British Social Attitude Survey, it means we've got a way to compare trends in attitudes on both sides of the borders. And you'll see some of that in a few minutes, when John's going to provide an overview of analysis which will draw on those 25 years of trend data, exploring whether the identities, the national identities and public policy preferences of Scots have diverged from those in the rest of Britain during our quarter century of devolution, and the changing interrelationship with views about how Scotland should be governed. So today's focus is very much on issues where SSA is uniquely well placed to consider trends since 1999. We're looking at issues like national identity, tax and spend, left and right wing standpoints, constitutional preferences and trust in government. But over the years, SSA has provided insight into public attitudes on a much wider range of topical issues, from access to rural services to young people. So you could say it's almost the A to Z of public attitudes. And Lucy's going to reflect a little on that wider insight later. But SSA is very much a legacy of colleagues past and present, and I wanted to pay some thanks to a few of those without whom we wouldn't be celebrating this significant milestone. So first of all, the individuals who had the ideas and motivation to initiate the study and obtain the funding for that first survey. So Alison Park and Katarina Thompson, David McCrone and Lindsay Patterson, Paula Surridge, Ben Seed, and of course, John. Our funders and commissioners have been crucial to the survey's success and longevity. The first survey was funded by 2 ESRC grants, and we're very grateful to the ESRC for providing that foundational opportunity. But I also want to single out the Scottish Government, who across different analytical teams have commissioned a great number of modules over the years. But a notable mention goes to colleagues mainly in the Office for the Chief Statistician, who have commissioned what we've come to know as the core module on attitudes to government and public services almost every year that the survey has run. I'd like to give a nod to ScotCen's survey interviewers who diligently and objectively gathered the study data over its initial 20 years. Those interviewers will tell you that SSA was not the easiest sell on the doorstep, but for many it became a firm favourite, a real chance to hear firsthand what the nation thought about important policy issues. And then a thanks also to our respondents, tens of thousands of randomly selected individuals from across Scotland who've been willing to give up their time to offer their opinions. And then a final thanks goes to ScotCen and NatCen research and operations colleagues, past and present, who've been fundamental to the development and delivery and success of the survey. The list is long and worthy, and I won't name individuals for fear of missing someone out. Many are in this room, and many more may be online. You know who you are. There is a certain and specific skill to designing a good attitudinal survey. It is writing succinct questions which truly capture the issue of interest. That is often harder than it sounds, particularly when that issue is complex, needs precisely defined in simple language, or is likely to provoke what we call a socially desirable response. And I asked colleagues for any key challenges they could recollect. One example given was as part of a module on attitudes to obesity. John's panicking a little bit now, because he's thinking, what am I going to say here? It's okay, John. A module on attitudes to obesity. With so much on the market, how could we ensure people understood from a neat sentence what was meant by food and drink that was high in fat, sugar or salt when asking about their views on taxing such items? So the challenge was creating a succinct definition, which we did. But there was quite a lot of debate about whether the word fizzy could be used alongside sugary drinks, in fact was necessary. A more sombre instance was the developing questions on people's attitudes towards traditional gender roles as part of a wider module on violence against women and girls. For this, ultimately, after a great many versions of the questions, the solution was to ask about gender stereotypes in children. And views on this issue were found to correlate with views on discrimination against women. So a special thank you to my research colleagues who have successfully grappled with this methodological challenge over the years. But SSA is alive and continues. We are in field with the 2025 survey at the moment, and in recent years we've seen some developments and changes, methodological developments in particular. In 2023, the study moved to a push-to-web approach, so addresses are still selected at random. The occupants of those addresses receive a letter inviting them to take part online, and up to 2 people per household are able to do so. And we conducted some analysis last year, published last year, which suggests this change in how the survey is conducted has not had a significant impact on the patterns of response. We've moved to a greater alignment with British social attitudes, both in terms of methodology and fieldwork patterns and data collection. And since 2019, we've also been routinely involved in the International Social Survey Programme through funding from the ESRC. So this programme allows, through use of a harmonised questionnaire, the comparison of attitudes in Scotland with those of over 40 other countries across the world, and recent topics that have included citizenship and national identity, health and healthcare, religion, and digital societies. And that data is available for external researchers to use. So SSA is and continues to be a high quality, unique and valuable resource for measuring and understanding public opinion in Scotland over the last 25 years. And we look forward to using it to do so for a great many years yet. So, moving on to affairs of today, I'm first going to invite Professor Sir John Curtis to speak. And John, as you can see from the slides up here, is going to give us an overview of a report that we've published today on 25 years of Scottish devolution, public attitudes and reactions. John is a Senior Research Fellow at ScotCen, Professor of Politics at Strathclyde and Chief Commentator on the What UK Thinks and What Scotland Thinks websites. He's been a co-director of Scottish Social Attitudes since its foundation in 1999, and he's also been a regular contributor to the annual British Social Attitudes Survey since 1986 and an editor on that survey since 1994. In 2018, he received a knighthood in the New Year's Honours List, and John is a regular commentator, as I'm sure you all know, on both British and Scottish politics. John.
Thank you very much, and Paul has saved me the job of having to talk to my first slide, which is very helpful, because he's already outlined some of the ways in which it had to be changed. But just historically, basically, we said to interviewers, here's a list of nice places for you to visit and cross the length and breadth of Scotland, and can you please knock on their doors and persuade them to do our interview for an hour? And that worked until COVID came along, and as Paul's already explained, there's been some adaptation since. The other thing one should say, and again, it's indicated what Paul has said, is that in a sense, Scottish social attitudes, like British social attitudes, has always had two principal objectives. One was to be able to study particular topics in depth. And Paul has mentioned some of the subjects we've done: obesity. We've done, for example, looking at discriminatory attitudes across a range of equalities debates, and taking a lot of questions in order to pursue things in greater depth than otherwise be the case. And of course, also inevitably, given we were starting at the time when Scotland was about to go through this very substantial constitutional change, we started with a legacy of quite a considerable number of questions about attitudes towards how Scotland is and should be governed. And that has therefore partly determined where Scottish social attitudes has strength and doesn't have strength, so far as its second objective is concerned, which is to be able to look at attitudes over time. And in a sense, today, this is a little bit of a kind of Jonathan Friedland type talk. That is, we're looking at the long view about what has happened over the last 25 years, rather than trying to say very much about where we are at present and how much we differs from the last Holyrood election in 2021 or the Westminster election last year. This is very, very much looking much more broadly at what has changed. And in effect, what I want to do is to go back and revisit some of the debates that were had at around the time of the 1997 referendum and with the instigation of the Parliament about what the consequences of creating devolution would be. Now, there is no doubt that for those, particularly inside the Labour Party, and indeed the Liberal Democrats, who were the primary instigators of devolution, the aim and expectation was that by creating this devolved institution, you would be able to demonstrate to the people of Scotland that actually the political framework of the United Kingdom was capable of addressing those needs and aspirations, and insofar as they were different from the rest of the UK, there was the potential for policy divergence, and that by demonstrating that within the Union, Scotland could have an adequate measure of self-government, this would help to reduce support for independence, or as one former Shadow Secretary of State put it, it would kill nationalism stone dead. But inevitably, there were those who took a different view. Some of them, indeed, hoped that it would not come out like that. Certainly, one of the potential possibilities was, well, you're creating here a set of political institutions that recognize and symbolize the distinctive sense of nationality, Scotland's distinct nationhood that it undoubtedly has. And that perhaps, in fact, what you would end up doing is undermining British identity if you were coming from a unionist perspective, or if you were coming from a nationalist perspective. Well, if you can demonstrate to people that we can run a Scottish Parliament and a Scottish government effectively, the natural next step will be to go for independence. So many of those on the nationalist side of the argument, they were happy to see devolution as a stepping stone to something else, as opposed to something that might help to preserve the Union. And meanwhile, of course, what was also true is that we were creating a policy space that was distinct from Westminster. We were making it possible for Scotland to have its own debates about issues being pursued by different politicians, the balance of whom, in terms of their political preferences, their policy ideas, may be different from those of Westminster. And certainly the aim of the exercise was indeed that there was opportunity for policy divergence. So that might occasion public attitudes in Scotland diverging from those in the rest of the UK, because essentially people in Scotland will be being exposed to different arguments, or at least the different balances of political preferences. So in the light of that, this talk and the paper focuses on three key questions. The first one comes out of my last point, which is, have identities and values diverged between Scotland and the rest of the UK? If I were to show you a graph that looked at attitudes towards some public policy issue, and I didn't tell you which country it was coming from, would you or would you not be able to tell whether this was data from Scotland or data from England? Secondly, then, to look at how well the devolved institutions are thought to have worked, because how people might do or do not think the next step would be is obviously clearly determined by potentially by their evaluations of how well they felt devolution was working out. And then I want to finally, of course, to turn to the crucial question, what's happened to constitutional preferences? Where do we now lie in Scotland so far as the constitutional question is concerned? And in particular, I want to look at how the answer to the first question and the answer to the third question can actually be brought together, because they would seem to lead to somewhat divergent conclusions. So I have long argued that the one thing that makes Scotland different from the rest of the UK is that it's Scottish. And the point is that within Scotland, Scottish identity is undoubtedly the predominant identity. It's not that Britishness is absent, but it's definitely secondary. This is one of two ways in which we address identity. This is what you get when you first of all give people a list of all the identities that are associated with the islands of Britain and Ireland, and so you can choose which of these describes you, and you can choose as many as you want. But if people then insist on naming more than one identity, what do they then say is the one that matters to them most? And there is actually an interesting paradox here. So actually, the idea that devolution has made Scotland more Scottish, you can already see it clearly doesn't work. Devolution was a recognition that Scotland was already Scottish and not primarily British. It was a consequence of identity, not a cause of change. And ironically, if anything, as you can see, it was around the time of the referendum. It's almost as though the referendum, for some people, helped to uncover their latent sense of Britishness, which maybe was almost taken for granted. But although it's now fallen off again in the most recent year, and we'll have to see whether that continues, actually, if anything, Scotland's been a wee bit less Scottish in the last 10 years since the referendum than it was beforehand. Second way of doing this is the so-called Moreno national identity question. Okay, essentially identity is about whether you feel Scottish or feel British. And it's a question that ranges from I am Scottish, not British, through to I am British, not Scottish. As you can see, there are very few people, and there have always been very few people, who say that they are either predominantly or wholly British. Most people say they are at least equally Scottish and British, but lots of people do acknowledge Britishness to a degree. But as you can see, there is, I mean, again, you can see how around the time of the referendum, the proportion of people who said they were exclusively Scottish did go down. It's now gone back up again. But the story of the two things is rather similar. So on identity, Scotland has always been different. It's no more different now than it was back in 1999. What about attitudes and policy preferences? Well, clearly one of the issues that is always central in political debate is whether or not you think we should be increasing taxes and spending more on government spending on things like health and education, or whether we should be cutting taxes and cutting spending. And this may be regarded, although we can debate it, as one of a number of issues where essentially we're tapping into whether or not people are more left-wing or more right-wing. And one of the things that's often said about Scotland is that it's more left-wing than England. It's certainly a claim that's often made by nationalists in Scotland. That's, again, one of the reasons as to why Scotland does need its own institutions, because it has different preferences. Well, there's a question that's been on British and Scottish social attitudes that on repeated occasions, which says, now, if you're forced to choose which direction you would go, the line with diamonds on it are the answers for Scotland, and the line with squares or rectangles on them are the answers for England. 2 points to make. One, yes, usually, though not always, Scotland is a wee bit more likely to say that we should be increasing taxes and spending, but it's only marginal. But the second thing to note is that the dynamics of responses to this question have been very, very similar on both sides of the border. I mean, essentially the story is that after the Labour Party started to increase public spending after about a couple of years into government at Westminster, and public services improved, then there began to be a public reaction against this, and they said, hang on, public services are great, could you now please reduce our taxes? And actually then in the run-up before COVID, although so-called austerity under the Conservatives didn't have much impact for a while, we were beginning to react in the opposite direction. And we've not, despite the very substantial expansion of the state in the last Westminster Parliament, haven't really gone back again. But the crucial point is the dynamics are very, very similar. There are also a whole load of questions, which I won't go into the detail here, but asked on British and Scottish social attitudes, which are designed to measure whether you are on the left or on the right. And they're all questions essentially about how unequal is our society, and what, if anything, should the government do about it? And that is essentially a left-wing point of view, as opposed to the view that says, no, the aim of government should be to achieve economic growth, increase the size of the overall pie from which we will all benefit. Now, as you can see, again, if you follow, again, the diamonds, a lower score here on the scale is the lower the score that somebody has, the more left-wing they have. So this is a score of right-winginess, if you want to have to. So therefore, most of the time, England is above Scotland. So yes, Scotland is a bit more left-wing. It's not dramatic. The differences in these scale scores are very small, although they did widen for much of the period from around 2014 through to 2019, but it has narrowed again. So we're still looking at a small difference, and the gap is no bigger now than it was back in 1999. So there's no evidence here of divergence. Another measure that we keep on carrying, which gets into where people stand on so-called cultural issues, it's also strongly related to Brexit. So it's whether you're a social liberal or a social conservative, a libertarian or authoritarian. And as you can see on this measure, Scotland and England look like the same country, and there is no evidence of divergence. We can also look at things where, as were rather more immediate, and in particular some of the policy challenges that governments have had to face on both sides of the border, which one obvious one is the state of the health service. And again, the remarkable thing is, for all the debate that we have north of the border about, the Scottish government has messed up this aspect of the health service and that aspect of the health service, and it's a debate that often seems to take place in entire ignorance, or at least failure to recognise the fact that the same debate's going on south of the border. Actually, when you look at public attitudes, i.e. whether or not people are satisfied with the NHS, it's a case of snap virtually every year, both in terms of the level of satisfaction, and of course also the fact that in the last 2 years, in the wake of COVID, satisfaction with the health service has fallen off a cliff. But it's nothing distinctively Scottish about this. It's exactly the same thing that has happened south of the border, because the policy challenges have been actually absolutely the same on both sides of the border, despite the fact that the partisan colour of the governments on the two sides of the border has been very, very different. So the broad answer to my first question is Scotland is no more different now than it was 25 years ago. And in many respects, if I gave you that mythical graph of showing you the distribution of attitudes without telling which country, you probably only got a 50% chance of getting it right. It's a toss of a coin. What about our second question? Now, one of the aspirations that was set out for Holyrood, after all, it was bringing government 400 miles up from London to just down the road, was that as a result, people in Scotland will be able to have more say in how they are governed. Scotland, it would be the country, Scotland will be governing itself to a considerable degree, and Holyrood would be much more accessible. And it was also selling itself as a more accessible institution. And indeed, back in 1999, just as the Parliament was being created, nearly 2/3 of people said, yeah, we think it's going to give us more say. Now, it's difficult to remember now, but actually the early years of devolution, it was a much criticised institution, not least in symbolically by the fact that the cost of that parliament down the bottom of the hill was meant to be 40 million quid. It ended up being 400 million quid, and it took somewhere between 2 and 3 times longer to complete than was originally intended. And that was a very substantial negative story that was running. And you can see, if you look at the squared lines, that indeed the proportion of people who thought we were getting more say was something like around little more than a half of the proportion of people who thought that was going to be the case before the institution was created. The change of administration in 2005 does, however, begin to see things change. And then perhaps unsurprisingly, until most recently, in the wake of the referendum, people have been thought they've been having more say. And almost undoubtedly the referendum, to that extent at least, maybe not consulting people on the things that everybody wanted to be consulted about, but boy, oh boy, weren't they being consulted about something important. Though again, and this is a couple of items where more recently, and perhaps it's to do with the public policy challenges, that public opinion has shifted back again. Similarly, ask whether or not they think the Scottish Parliament, initially and then more recently the Scottish Government, can be trusted to work in Scotland's best interests. Well, point one is what devolution has going for it is that it's Scottish. The devolved institutions are always regarded more highly than is the UK government. But again, you will see 81% of people said, yeah, I think I'm going to be able to trust this new institution. The level of trust initially was markedly lower than that. It did then rise again around 2007. But again, there's an issue about where things are at more recently. Meanwhile, finally, there's the question of, well, how influential is this Parliament? In fact, as I'm going to show you in a moment, people from the very, very beginning were saying that the Parliament should be the most influential body in Scotland. It should be primarily determining what happened. But this is how people views have evolved in terms of who does have most influence. In the early years of the Parliament, relatively few people thought that this institution was making much difference. In some sense, perhaps that was inevitable. It was going to take a while before it became evident that things might be done differently in Scotland. Indeed, you can see this just gradually, if you follow the circled line, that it gradually improved. And it got to a point where it was around, as many people saying, the Scottish Parliament, stroke government, was the more influential body as the UK government, and then essentially it flatlined out. Well, one exception to that, perhaps unsurprising, is 2021, in the midst of the COVID pandemic, when, of course, at least the public face of the public health regulations in Scotland were coming from Edinburgh. They weren't coming from London. They were sometimes markedly different, and it's interesting to see that that is the one time when the devolved institutions were thought to be having more influence north of the border than the UK government, but it's subsequently gone back again to balance. But, and this now leads me into my third question, there has always been an imbalance between who people think should be the most influential body, to which the answer for between 2/3 and 3/4 has always been the devolved institutions and their perceptions. And to that extent, at least, there's always been this gap between how powerful Holyrood is thought to be and how powerful people collectively in Scotland think it should be. And that therefore takes us to one of the certainly key legacies that go all the way back to the 1999 referendum. In fact, there are 1 or 2 readings of this that go back before then. But this is a question that was crafted in the 1990s. You can see its age. It refers to how independence inside and outside the European Union, because it was crafted not long after the SNP switched from being anti-EU to pro-EU. I always love to remind SNP politicians about about the stance they adopted in 1975. And equally also, of course, because in advance of the 1997 referendum, and Tony Blair's certain squeamishness about the then tax-raising powers, there was also a debate about whether the institutions have tax-raising powers. For simplicity's sake, we will combine the first 2 groups and combine the 3rd and 4th groups. But the value of keeping on asking this question, somewhat dated as it is, that this is the one measure we've got of constitutional preference that's been asked in the same way all the way through the 25 years of devolution. The levels of support for independence, the squares are those who prefer a devolved parliament, and the triangles are the folk who say, why do we have those numpties down the road? We don't want any of them. And that's never been a particularly popular point of view. As you can see, all the way through, up to and before the 2014 referendum, varied to a degree, but the devolution was more popular than independence. Support for independence oscillated between around a quarter and around a third. But although the yes side lost the referendum, the legacy of the 2014 referendum, and I think now 10 years on, we can acknowledge whatever your views about what you would or would not prefer to be the case. I think we now have to acknowledge that the legacy of the 2014 referendum, together also with, to some degree, also the consequences of the 2016 one, is to have resulted in a fundamental change in the distribution of constitutional preferences in Scotland, and that as a result, Scotland has moved from a country where it was pretty clear that it preferred devolution to independence to where it's now basically split down the middle. We can also see another set of questions we've been asking more recently, which was designed also to get at the idea, well, maybe what Scotland wants is not independence per se, but what came to be known for a while during the run-up to the 2014 referendum as devolution max. That is basically Scotland running everything apart from defence and foreign affairs, and as it were, almost becoming an imitation of the Isle of Man or Guernsey and Jersey, though the proposal was never to quite go that far. But as you can see from, again, where the circles are, these are the folk who, when being, here we were asked, I've simply been asking a question, who should make decisions for Scotland? So don't use any of this constitutional mumbo-jumbo about independence or separation or what, of the union or whatever. Just ask people who should be responsible for what. But as you can see, around a half of people have been tending to say the Scottish Parliament should decide the lot. You've had around 30% of people going for what we might call Devo Max, i.e. everything apart defence and foreign affairs. And then everything else is weaker. And you can certainly see how the green line, which in effect was the status quo ante before we started giving tax and welfare powers, particularly via the Smith Commission after the 2014 referendum, has become less popular. So you can see how the instinct of people in Scotland, again, is decisions made north of the border. Now, this leaves us with a bit of a paradox. So on the one hand, those things that some people were concerned about and some people hoped would lead to divergence between Scotland and the rest of the UK, i.e. Scotland's distinct sense of identity, that indeed it's more left-wing, etc., that these things haven't really changed. But in terms of how Scotland does want to be governed, it has changed, and we do now have more support for independence. So what's going on here? How is it that a country that in terms of its attitudes, its values, its policy preferences and identities looks almost like the same country as 25 years ago, actually now have a very different constitutional outlook? And the answer is that the link between people's constitutional preferences and what they believe in and their sense of identity has become markedly stronger over the course of the last 25 years. The debate about a constitution is no longer a debate simply about sovereignty. It's also become a debate about substance, or rather it's become interlinked with people's views about substance. Here's example number one. This is to do with identity. Yes, it's always been true, see the left-hand side, that people who feel that they are primarily or exclusively Scottish are much more likely to say that they support independence. But if you go back to the turn of the century, less than half, even amongst those who said, I am Scottish and I'm not British, were in favour of independence. Now it's 3/4, whereas the figure has hardly changed on the right-hand side, unsurprisingly. The Brits still want to be in Britain. So you can see how identity has become more strongly aligned with people's constitutional preference. The same thing has happened in terms of where people stand on our left-right divide. Yes, as I said earlier, people on the left have always been somewhat more inclined to be in favour of independence. That's the top line here, than people on the right. But notice how the lines have widened. So now people on the left in Scotland, now being on the left in Scotland is more clearly aligned with being pro-independence than it was 25 years ago. And even that libertarian-authoritarian divide, there may not be much difference from England, but social liberals in Scotland, libertarians are now very clearly more likely to be in favour of independence than are those of more authoritarian bent, whereas there was virtually no difference between these two groups. If anything, the authoritarians tend to be slightly more likely to be in favour of independence in the early years of devolution. Why has that latter thing occurred? Well, whether you're a social liberal or social conservative is aligned with your views on Brexit. And the other thing that's now become much more clearly aligned with people's attitudes towards the constitutional question is where they stand on Europe. Here I'm using a measure which divides Eurosceptics from Europhiles. That means I can look back to before the independence referendum. Notice 2013, 2014, 2015. We had all that whole debate during the independence referendum about whether Scotland could be a continuing member of the EU. It was all a complete waste of time. Attitudes towards Europe and attitudes towards independence were unrelated. Now they very clearly are. People who want to be inside the European Union are now much more likely to be in favour of being Scotland becoming independent than not. So that's the summary. In some respects, we look the same. Devolution in some respects has got a better press over time, albeit a bit of a question mark most recently. But there's still clearly a gap between people's aspirations for Scotland's institutions, or at least some people's aspirations for Scotland's institutions, and where they think we are at. Yet, and in light of that, perhaps not surprising, that actually in terms of constitutional preferences we look different. But we look different not simply because we now are much more likely to be in favour of independence than we were 25 years ago, and to that extent, the original Labour project for devolution has not worked, but it's also because it's become much more clearly intertwined with other aspects of what we think about this country and how we identify with it, which I think in the end means that it's actually become a more difficult issue to resolve politically than it was 25 years ago. And to that extent, at least, the legacy of devolution is still going to be the subject of quite considerable debate.
Well, thank you, John. I'm sure you all have many burning questions, but we're going to just hold on to them for another little while I invite the first of our additional speakers today to give her reflections. Professor Ailsa Henderson is going to come up and give some reflections on John and Sophie's analysis. Ailsa is Professor of Political Science at the University of Edinburgh, where she leads the Scottish Election Study and co-leads the Future of England and State of the Union surveys. Ailsa is also the chair of the Boundaries Scotland, which sets electoral boundaries for Holyrood and local elections, and she's deputy chair of the Politics and International Studies sub-panel for the 2029 Research Excellence Framework. Ailsa, thank you.
Thank you very much. It feels very strange to be here without any slides to present. I've been reading Scottish Social Attitudes Survey and British Social Attitudes Survey work since my MSc in Social Research at the University of Edinburgh, and now that I understand Paul has a very elastic understanding of timing, let's also say that that was 25 years ago. And I've been referencing John's 1988 and 1992 chapters on the differences of attitudes between people in Scotland and England for as long as I can remember. The Scottish Social Attitudes Survey and the BSES provide us continually with an essential time series for data. They provide us with unparalleled insights on stability and change in the face of significant world events. So they're tremendously valuable to me as a researcher. And some of this year's report is also reassuring for us in the Scottish election study because it confirms what we're finding as well since 2007. So by one example, that almost orthogonal relationship we see between independence and Brexit support changing over time so that it's more aligned. That's reassuring that we're finding the same thing. If I was asked to change anything about this year's report, I would just like it to have been longer. I would like there to have been more of it. I would have liked to see more on immigration, for example. I would have liked some multivariate models to test the effect of some of these relationships when you control for other things. But as a general contribution to knowledge on Scottish attitudes, I think this year's contribution is interesting and helpful and provocative, and we can't really ask for more than that. I want to comment on three things in particular. First of all, I want to talk about identity measurement. The report notes that the long-term trend is one of stability and identity measurement, but we can see variations, including that increase in Britishness from the period 2013 onwards. To me, that looks like an increased salience of the Constitution in devolved politics that has had a polarizing effect on identity in Scotland. What also strikes me is the stability in the any and best measures of national identity and the comparative chaos in the Moreno scales, which is particularly evident if you look at the trend data in the report over time. I can still remember the tables in the Brown et al. Works that were using 1997 and 1999 data when we had about 8% of the electorate describing themselves as either more British than Scottish or British not Scottish. I think it was 23%, 38, 27, then 4, 4, 4. So you were as likely in those days to say that you had absolutely no identity as you were to say that you were British only. And if we compare that to the fact that there was about a quarter of the electorates in Wales and Scotland saying the equivalent, I think that marked Scotland out as remarkable. But what also is remarkable is the magnitude of the change since then. And actually, in listening to John's presentation, I think that's partly why we are seeing an increased relationship between national identity and constitutional preference. In a world in which everyone describes themselves as Scottish, and yet there is variation on the constitutional question, then you will have a weak relationship between national identity and constitutional preference. But if those people who oppose independence start to describe themselves as British more than they did before, then what we will see naturally is a strengthening of that relationship between national identity and constitutional preference. But this year's report also prompts me to wonder about the relationship across these measures, and particularly the importance of salience, because none of the measures here really tell us about how important someone's national identity is to someone. We know, for example, from the Union survey that if we use the Moreno category and we look at people who describe themselves, for example, as English, not British, and then ask them on a scale of 0 to 10 how British or how English they feel, those people who say under Moreno that they do not feel British at all, about 12% of them put 0 out of 10. So everybody else picks some form of strength of Britishness for an identity that they professed in an earlier question not to hold at all. So I use the Moreno question all the time. I find it tremendously helpful for visualization, but I do find at times it overestimates or it underestimates the salience of the not X, whatever it is, identity, and it overestimates the salience of the X not identity as well. My own view is that one helpful extra measure is the relative territorial identity one. So you can take a 0 to 10 scale for Scottishness, a 0 to 10 scale for Britishness, subtract one from the other, and you can get a sense of both strength and the gap between that. So my unhelpful suggestion is please ask more questions about national identity in your survey. Second thing I wanted to talk about was evaluations about time scales, and I was staring at John's slides there and then thinking of my necklace and thought, oh my God, they're going to think I've dressed like a data point in the graph here, and that's too tragic even for me. I promise I haven't done that. So the trend data does provide us with a sense, some cause for concern. There's a range of measures in the report that illustrate increased dissatisfaction with standard of living, decrease in government approval by providing us with these incredibly long time periods. I think that this year's offering really provides a useful corrective on some of the graph massaging that can occur, choosing start points that can really illustrate or maximize the perceived decline. So for example, if we look at government approval, for example, were we to only be looking from 2011 onwards, we would see a clear decline in government approval. But if we look at it in the longue durée, as this year's offering does, if we go back to the very beginning, we're actually, in terms of government approval, more or less where we were at the, just at the second devolved election. So in that case, a longer time period reinforces the stability that's occurring within the Scottish electorate. And trust, in fact, shows the opposite by expanding the time frame beyond what we normally see if we're just looking at SNP era government. It actually heightens the decline in trust that has occurred. If anything, I would have liked to see more in terms of the effects of COVID. I think if we're looking at data about how Scotland is run, for example, I think the increases there speak to kind of COVID era effects. And also in terms of time changes, if we're looking at the relationship between left-right attitudes and support for independence, we can see a general period effect of the referendum. So all groups, left or right, had an increase in their support for independence, and then afterwards we see a kind of polarization, fracturing effect. And it's the same if we're looking at the libertarian, authoritarian, but we also know that's exactly what the age graph looks like. And I think partly that's because there will be age effects tangled up with the left-right effects and the libertarian, authoritarian effects, and that's partly why I was, that was partly explaining my curiosity around models. The third thing I want to talk about, though, is the main thing about what John was talking about, the gap between Scottish and English attitudes, and partly I'm interested in that because that's most of what I do when I'm working away from the Scottish election study, that difference we have in Scotland between differences in values and differences in political culture, objective difference, and then also a subjective perception of difference. In Scotland, there is a considerable body of work from the Scottish Social Attitude Survey, to which this year's contribution adds, that shows our values fundamentally are not different. We make different conclusions at the ballot box, but the underlying value disposition of the Scottish electorate is not markedly different from the English one. None of that, however, seems to shift the fact that we are absolutely convinced that in our political culture of our perceived distinctiveness. Indeed, as John noted, it was one of the arguments for devolution. We have different policy preferences, and therefore we deserve to have those different preferences reflected in the legislation that governs our lives. But if we look at tax and spend, or left, right, libertarian, authoritarian, they move almost in lockstep on the policy issues. They move thermostatically in Scotland as they do in England. So if we have this long-running trend in data that shows that we are objectively very similar to England, my question is, why do we keep believing that we're different than we are? What purpose does that serve us and political debate, and who is most susceptible to those claims? So from the Scottish election study and from the Union survey, we know that in Scotland, people typically perceive themselves to be to the left of where they actually are. We know that people consistently misperceive the placement of parties, exaggerating where they are on a left-right scale, but also we know in the Union, across the Union, the level of misperception varies. So Scots think Scotland is to the left of where it is. We think Wales is to the left of where it is. We think England is to the right of where it is. Wales makes the same mistakes we do. But England, more or less, gets it right. And so one argument for why that might be the case, of course, is that our national legislature is reinforcing that sense of distinctiveness, including about being more left-wing than the rest of the state, while Westminster does not serve the same purpose for England, arguably because it doesn't really talk very much about England and refers to this nebulous thing called this country. But it happens outside Scotland in the rest of the state. It happens in Wales, so it happens in Scotland, it happens in Wales. It also happens in other states. It happens in Canada, and I've been working with colleagues there, trying to understand why people feel that their province is distinct from the rest of the state and who's more likely to do so. We know overwhelmingly that people think their province is distinct even when it isn't. We know that that correlates with your regional identity. We also know that it correlates with reality, that the more distinct your province is, you are really likely to believe that it's distinct. We know you're more likely to perceive that you're distinct if you're embedded within a community. You're less likely to think it's distinct if you're bicultural. In other words, if you've moved around and you lived in different locations within the state. You're also likely to estimate in the direction of your own preferences. So we understand that this is happening all the time. So people misperceive their distinctiveness, and they also misperceive the direction of the error. So we always assume that we are more supportive of policy areas, regardless of whether those policy areas are areas that might be associated with the right or with the left. So I guess my question, in light of the data that we've been presented with today, is about, given these rich findings, what impact does this have on the wider body politic and the policies that we support and that we don't? So is it possible that believing the Scottish electorate was more to the left of where it was, or more libertarian than it was, is part of what caused the SNP problems when it was trying to navigate GRR through legislative channels, for example? So while I find the report tremendously helpful as a descriptive account of where we are now and where we've been, for me, I think its real value is that it also prompts, it provides a prompt for wider social science activity and research questions that we can ask about who we are and where we've got there. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ailsa. Really fantastic provocation and further thought there, and I know John is probably desperate to respond to that final question there, but we're going to just hold off a little longer. I mean, one question I have is, if Scotland and England are so similar, what has happened to the football? Anyway, we move on, and then there'll be fewer of those kinds of jokes going forward. Our final speaker this afternoon is our colleague Lucy Dean, and Lucy is a senior researcher at ScotCen, where she's been with us for 10 years. And during that time, she's delivered a great many projects utilising both quantitative and qualitative methods and exploring a whole range of policy areas. But one of these key projects for her has been Scottish social attitudes, and she's worked on the survey over a number of years, alongside surveys such as the Scottish Health Survey, Realigning Children's Services, and mixed method projects like Behaviour in Scottish Schools and the Student Finance and Wellbeing Study. And Lucy is going to reflect on just a little more of the wider topics and findings that SSA has had over the years, and how some of those might likely to have changed if we were to measure them now. Lucy.
Hi everyone. SSA is one of these surveys that when it comes to the reporting time and it's time to start writing up some of the modules, there's a little bit of an fight in ScotCen about who gets to work on them, because it's such an interesting survey. It's been a privilege to be involved in so many modules of the survey over the years, and I know there's quite a few colleagues here who have been involved in many, many more than I have as well, and right back since the beginning. So I'm going to talk to you a bit about SSA's wider value on topic areas that we can track public attitudes on, which is an important resource for government, policy makers, and third sector organisations. So SSA has and continues to capture public views on key topics for society, and I'm going to share with you a couple of examples that I've had the opportunity to be involved with, and also some pertinent topic areas for the future of SSA that we could explore. So just a bit more background on some of the topic areas that we've covered over the years. So as John and Paul mentioned, SSA has been conducted almost every year since 1999. And in addition to the core module topics that the Scottish Government have funded all of those years on topics including trust in government, spending priorities, the standard of the NHS. Over the years, there's been a number of other areas relating to social issues that have been captured. So to name a few of them, the discrimination and attitudes towards discrimination and positive action, mental health and prejudice surrounding this, and mental health in the workplace, welfare, income and poverty, health and social inequalities and housing and homelessness, work and childcare and flexible working, violence against women and girls, religion and politics and religious extremism, Scotland's handling of the COVID pandemic, which was in the 2021 survey, problem drug and alcohol use and public views on policies such as minimum unit pricing and various policies relating to obesity and overweight in Scotland, smoking and digital access to healthcare. So funders have been fairly wide-ranging, as well as the Scottish Government funding quite a few of these modules. There's also been Public Health Scotland, the Economic and Social Research Council, and the Equality and Human Rights Commission. Bord na Gaelic have funded some questions on attitudes towards Gaelic and Scots and the preservation of those languages and cultures within Scotland. So there's been some Scottish-specific modules as well, and various charitable and grant-awarding bodies such as the Nuffield Foundation and the Leave a Home Trust. So to give a bit of a flavour about how SSA can be used to track attitudes on key issues, I'm going to talk to you briefly about some of the interesting findings over time on a couple of very different topic areas. And you're very welcome to delve into them further. The reports are published online of all of the previous areas that we've worked on. So firstly, attitudes towards discrimination and positive action, which has been asked at 4 different time points. This module is being run currently on SSA 25, and it's in field just now and will be published next year. Prior to this, it was last run a decade ago, so there's been quite a big gap there. And then beforehand at 3 different time points, every 3 to 5 years. The 2025 findings will be greatly pertinent given the changes to the social and political landscape in the last decade and some of the key issues facing society. I'm going to talk about a few of the key changes that I found particularly interesting in 2015. So nearly 7 in 10 people in Scotland felt that Scotland should do everything it can to get rid of all kinds of prejudice. This had remained a very similar figure since 2002, remained pretty stable. However, the proportion who felt that sometimes there was a good reason to be prejudiced fell from 28% from 28% to 22% since 2010. There also appeared to be a trend towards people in Scotland holding more positive attitudes towards diversity. So between 2010 and 15, there was a 10 percentage point decline in the percentage who said they would rather live in an area where most people are similar to them. And nearly half said they would prefer to live in an area with lots of different kinds of people. 4 in 10 in 2015 agreed that people from outside Britain who come to live in Scotland make the country a better place, which was a significant increase from 2010, when around 3 in 10 held this view. Some of the other interesting questions, among many in that module, were to explore levels of acceptance and discriminatory views. Respondents were asked if they'd be happy or unhappy if a close relative married or formed a long-term relationship with someone from different groups who share certain protected characteristics. So similarly to 2010, it was found that the 2 groups that the public were most prejudiced towards in Scotland were those who are transgender and also those who are gypsy or traveller. So nearly a third said they'd be unhappy if a close relative married or formed a long-term relationship with each. So it will be interesting to look at the changes in the last decade on that, and that's definitely something to look out for next year in terms of the report. And now moving on to a very different area, to give a different example, SSA has asked the public across 3 different time points about their perceptions of people with problem drug use. The most recent was in 2021, with the two previous quite longer ago in 2001 and 2009. So the findings in 21 indicate that while there's a recognition of the social impact of drug use on society, there's also a growing acceptance of recovery and the possibility of recovery. Now, John referred earlier on to being able to see the age of certain questions. So as the first two surveys were asked in 2001 and 2009, heroin was used to refer to in certain questions as a proxy to gauge people's view on more serious problem drug use. So with these surveys that continue over time, we do have to retain wording in some of these to be able to track differences, whilst we're sometimes able to bring new questions in and maybe clarify the terminology of some as well. So there was evidence of a shift to more compassionate and understanding attitudes on a number of items. The belief that recovery is possible. Just under a quarter agreed that most people who use heroin can never stop using drugs completely, which was 6 percentage points lower than in 2009. Understanding the impact of societal factors has changed quite dramatically in that time. So in 2021, half of people in Scotland thought that individuals who use heroin come from difficult backgrounds, which had risen from 29% in 2009. Level of comfort with regards to living near someone who is getting help for problem drug use. So that was 30% in 2021 who felt comfortable with this prospect. And this had fallen, the percentage who said they felt uncomfortable had fallen from 49% in 2009 to 32% in 2021. The other area that one of the many areas again covered by this report is attitudes towards the legality of possession of a small amount of different types of drugs. So in 2021, 42% agreed that individuals possessing heroin for personal use should not be prosecuted, and 36% disagreed. This was a marked shift from 2009, when only 16% agreed and 3/4 disagreed. So that's just to pick on a couple of areas that we've tracked over time among many that I've had the privilege to work on. So thinking now about future pertinent topics for SSA, there's a number of crucial issues affecting society that would be useful to gather perspectives on more regularly. So some of these have never been included on SSA and have been included on BSA. So for example, attitudes towards conflict, the military and armed forces, and towards the environment and tackling climate change and transport and the role of transport in that. These could be really valuable to help inform campaigns and public support and initiatives. There's some other pertinent topic areas that hugely impact people's lives, which we have in the past asked questions on every few years or so, but they haven't been asked now for over a decade. Particularly thinking of attitudes towards mental health, which was last asked in 2013. And we've reached an important time for revisiting this, especially with the Scottish Government having published the Mental Health and Wellbeing Strategy and Delivery Plan in 23 to 25. BSA has more recently asked questions on public knowledge of how to look after one's own mental health and on attitudes towards mental health conditions in the workplace, which would be useful to capture among the Scottish public, as well as some other really poignant areas for society, such as mental health among young people, perceptions of how much support there is for this, and factors that impact this, such as cost of living, social media, and body image. And also how people feel about seeking help for treatment for mental health, what people consider as valid, appropriate support, medication, the role that medication plays, and the role of group therapy and talking therapy, and more holistic approaches as well. And also social isolation and loneliness would be an important topic to cover. If anybody has questions about SSA at any point, Paul and I and the team would be very happy to help, and if anyone has any questions about potential future modules, we'd also be delighted to help with those too. Thank you.
So thanks very much, Lucy, and I'm sure, given some recent high-profile reporting and events, an update on discrimination and attitudes to discrimination, we look forward to seeing those results next year, and updates on some of those other topics certainly would be pertinent too. So we've now got a good bit of time for questions and discussion. Before we start, I might ask our two other speakers to join us on the stage. We'll be taking questions in the room, but we've also got people who have joined us online, and there'll be an opportunity to take some of those first. But I guess whilst Ailsa and Lucy are taking their seats, John, I wonder if you had anything to say in response to Ailsa's comments.
Well, I mean, first of all, thank you very much, Ailsa, for taking the trouble to read through what we've done. I'll just make 3 quick points. Yes, I would love to be able to measure more questions on national identity. One of the constraints, I mean, essentially, SSA operates through managing to persuade some people to fund some of it, such that we can then therefore afford to put some other questions on to maintain time series that maybe nobody's trying to do. We have actually used 0 to 10 scales in the past, but that was when somebody had the money to fund it. But I mean, I guess my only question is, while we might learn a little bit more about the subtlety of national identity, whether we'll learn anything more about its politicization, perhaps, you know, that's another matter. On COVID, well, the truth is that COVID was not good for SSA. And we managed to run a survey in 2021, though in both cases using somewhat rather different methodologies. And whereas in the end, partly because I was able to get a grant out of the urgent grants that you could get COVID, and in the end because we got BSA together, there is quite a lot you can do about COVID, perceptions of COVID and public attitudes, et cetera, across the UK as a whole. I'm afraid in part we just don't really have the data to really pursue what was the impact of COVID, other than I think one has to say that certainly, with one possible exception, which I'll come to at the moment, it's not entirely clear to me that in the end, the COVID experience had that much impact on public attitudes. The one potential caveat, and we won't know the answer to this in 5 years, is you would have seen in the graph on taxation and spending that while there has been some decline in support for more tax and spend, both in Scotland and in England, given the increase in the size of the state and the level of taxation and spending that occurred during the last Parliament and is still projected to occur during this Parliament, the public reaction has been less than you might otherwise have expected, and that therefore it may be, and I emphasise the maybe there, it may be that the pandemic has been like war. It witnessed the unprecedented rescue of the labour market by the state. And is it going to be an occasion like war, where as a result it increases our appetite for a bigger state? Of course, there are other pressures going on as to why we need a bigger state, not least the ageing of society and the implications of all of that for public expenditure. So there are other things going on there as well. You talked a little bit about interactions between age and Brexit and libertarian, authoritarian, etc. I think you were wanting to suggest maybe the driver is age. I suspect the answer is the other way around, because certainly the relationship between age and support for independence has indeed strengthened. It's something that's in the report, but I didn't show in the slides. But it looks to me that that is a consequence of the fact that the relationship between attitudes towards the EU and independence, well, have gone from nothing to being quite important. And of course, the relationship between age and attitudes towards the EU is quite substantial. So, but in the end, in the absence of in the absence of panel data, disentangling which of these is moving first is very difficult to do. You then raised I thought, the very interesting question about, you know, to what extent does people's perceptions of Scotland affect the public policy they're pursuing. And of course, one of the things here, I mean, one of the ways in which Scotland is now markedly different in terms of public policy, and it's something that's been paved the way by the Smith Commission. And in a sense, the big call that the devolved institutions has made over the last 5 years or so is to spend a significant more amount of money on welfare and to fund it through basically increased taxation above people above median incomes. It's a big call because, as the Scottish Fiscal Commission keeps on pointing out, the cost of doing this will increase over time. But it's based on the belief that we need to reduce inequality. Now, the truth is that one of the things that has in fact long also been true is that there's been a link between whether you're on the left or not and your sense of identity. People who feel Scottish are more likely to be on the left. And I think, therefore, it's unsurprising that people who feel Scottish, many of whom are inside the SNP, are therefore inclined to the view that Scotland as a whole is markedly more left. The truth is they don't attend meetings, as I occasionally do, because I'm asked to go to speak to meetings of the Conservative Party in Scotland, and then you realise there is another Scotland out there other than the one, the dominant image that you get. So I think it may be able to be true that the way in which public policy has moved in the wake of the Smith Commission may indeed be an example, and one could say, well, I mean, I think we could then have an interesting debate as to whether or not the parties south of the border are emphasising reducing taxation too much because they have failed to recognise the change in the zeitgeist, or whether the government north of the border has exaggerated the extent to which Scotland has appetite for these things. And I think, frankly, we can continue to have that debate. But I think that's one of the ways in which the question you raise is useful. I mean, on the issue of transgender, which you mentioned in particular, I think here one has to understand that on both sides of the border, attitudes changed in the light of the debate. The attitudes of, I mean, it moved from being an issue. Well, I mean, it's clear that it's long been the case that there is social acceptance of people transitioning. And frankly, people don't care whether a woman wears trousers, because actually most women do wear trousers these days. It's one of the other social changes of the last 25 years. And that a man decides to wear a skirt, I mean, particularly north of the border. I mean, there isn't any debate about that. The debate got to be about legal rights. And of course, it's the first of the equalities debates where the right that was being claimed for one equality group was regarded as being cutting across the right of another equality group, i.e. women. And certainly as a result of that debate that was instigated by the legislation in Scotland, you can see that attitudes moved in the direction of not making it easier for people to transition legally. So I think that's a case where actually the politicians might have been right when they started the process, but unfortunately for them, they were in the wrong place by the time the process had finished.
Okay. Any questions, first of all, from the audience? Okay, we'll take one here. Yeah.
Oh, it's on. Aye, thanks. Fascinating new report. And as I also said, very happy that it lines up with what we've got in the SES data.
I'd be troubled if we didn't. We are trying to study the same society, yeah.
And you know, it's over a much longer time frame, which is great. One of the bigger changes in Scotland socially since the start of the evolution is population composition. So the share of foreign-born people in Scotland, and particularly English-born people in Scotland, has increased quite a lot. And I'm wondering to what extent you think that has impacted attitudes or not, particularly given the English people or the English-born people in Scotland are at least as or slightly more socially liberal than native-born Scots from what I've observed.
Yeah, they tend to be more socially liberal, but they tend to be less keen on independence. So it's not going to explain the rise in support for independence. And given that Scotland has not particularly markedly changed in terms of how social liberal it is, but the data are there. I mean, the problem, of course, you probably have to start aggregating data across years because, you know, it's still the case that a proportion of non-Scots-born population. But I think, I stand to be corrected, Lucy, can you remember, are we still collecting where people were born on SSA? We certainly have done at various points historically.
I'm not sure if we are.
No, I'm not sure if we are or not. Anyway, we'll make a note. Maybe we should add it to the litany of the endless list of questions we ask about people's background.
Ailsa, did you want to come in on that one?
Just that we know there's, on the issue of independence and where people were born, we know there's a difference on constitutional preferences and engagement with the constitutional debate between those who are born outside Scotland and outside the UK and those who are born elsewhere in the UK. So people who are born outside the UK are actually much closer to Scottish-born on their constitutional preferences, but they are much less likely to say, they're much less likely to self-report as being confident to engage in the debate. Whereas people who are born in the rest of the UK are quite confident to engage in the debate, but are much less like Scottish-born people. So it's interesting for us to disaggregate between constitutional preferences and also attitudes to the whole constitutional debate on the one hand, and then also disaggregate by where outside Scotland are you coming from? Are you coming from England or are you coming from Belgium?
Yeah, but it's what you'd expect, yeah?
Yes, yeah.
Rachel? There's one there.
Hello? Okay, that is working. Thank you. Those were really great, really sort of thought-provoking, and yeah, I'm very glad you're repeating the discrimination module, but yeah, possibly slightly approaching the results with some trepidation. I was reflecting on what Ailsa was saying about how Scotland sees itself and the kind of links between that and John's point about the strengthening of the relationship between constitutional preference and left-right, liberal authoritarian and so on. And it seems to me that kind of one of the effects of the referendum campaign has been to attach particular values to independence in the public consciousness so that it is seen as essentially a left-wing, liberal, pro-European venture. Aside from the pro-European bit, none of that is really about kind of the constitution as such or constitutional arrangements. Sure. So I guess my question probably is what the implications of that are for the policies being pursued by the current UK government and what impact they may have on constitutional preference in the future, but also what the implications might be if reform, as it may well do, has a number of MSPs after the 2026 Holyrood election.
You're moving us away from the long view to the short view, Rachel. So, I mean, I'll come back to the first part of your question. I mean, I mean, it's certainly true. One of the two strands, principal arguments that was being pursued by the Scottish government in say to what Scottish government independence is that it would create an opportunity for Scotland to become a more equal society. And to that extent, at least, you know, we can't prove it, but it's not an unreasonable hypothesis to believe that perhaps that therefore has helped to embed the idea of independence as being more popular amongst those on the left. On the other hand, of course, what was also curious about the 2014 referendum is that the only tax cut that was being offered or dangled before the people of Scotland as a result of independence was a cut in corporation tax. And to that extent, at least, the other side of the argument was that, you know, it would make Scotland economically better off. And of course, that argument still continues. But yeah, sure. I mean, that second, well, I think it was the second strand behind independence was certainly something that you might think would occur as a result of it would help to create this left-right divide on independence, because indeed that was the way in which it was being sold. Of course, you know, it does mean that one of the fascinating things about the debate, I mean, you know, some of us who kind of, you know, stand aside from the whole debate go, so, you know, why is it that you're really, really keen to want independence, but why then do you dangle onto this Christmas tree all of these things that you think might happen as a consequence, all right? Whereas, of course, the only thing that we really know that would happen as a result of independence is that Scotland would indeed be able to make its own decisions. But what decisions an independent Scotland might make in 10 or 20 years' time, who knows? it might, in the wake of, I mean, particularly, have to remember that, Moses didn't inherit the promised land. And, one of the fundamental questions that would face Scottish politics, if indeed we were to have independence, is whether the SNP would survive the experience of independence. UKIP did not survive the experience of Brexit, although it's obviously been resurrected in a different form now because Brexit's been rather disappointing. So, I mean, but the truth is, people do try to dangle around it the idea that if we make this constitutional shift, it will make it possible to change society in this way. And certainly there have been some arguments that have been used to help to explain why some of these alignments might have occurred.
Yeah, I mean, I think on the argument, what kind of a society do you want? Do you want one where this gap between rich and poor is large or small? We know that argument was actually more effective as the referendum campaign continued. And in fact, 1 week, because we had rolling cross-section stuff in the Scottish referendum study, and it showed us that 1 week before the referendum, that argument was absolutely driving people towards yes, and it was much stronger than it was, for example, 4 weeks out for the referendum. So it was not just popular, but it was popular and gaining traction as the referendum day approached. And I obviously agree with John, this assumption that we'll have the parties we have now, and those parties will advocate the things that they advocate now in any possible world in which Scotland becomes independent is not something that we can assume, and that we should probably look at the literature on fragment societies. When you take a fragment of a political culture and then you plunk it down, and if it's part of a whole in one place, but becomes the whole in a new place, what does that then do? So there's a whole literature on that I would encourage people to look at. For me, what's interesting, I guess, is that the transition we would make is that we would no longer have the constitutional status quo to blame for our various problems. And I think that is relevant. And also, if we think about the campaign for English votes for English laws, we have a parliament that's unresponsive to English needs. Let's introduce English votes for English laws. Well, we've introduced it. Does anyone notice that it's there? No. But when we tell people it's happened, they think, well, it's gone again, yeah. But when it was there and we told people, well, it's there, they say, well, it doesn't go far enough, right? So the introduction of evil did not satisfy demand for evil. Arguably, the introduction of Brexit did not satisfy demand for Brexit, because we still see that people who feel strongly believe that we're still too close to the European Union. I mean, arguably, those who are complaining about immigration, whatever changes we make, that will still not satisfy a demand for change there. So we have a habit of identifying problems and sometimes easy, sometimes less easy solutions to those problems. The significant change that would occur with independence is that we would have to come up with different arguments for why we're in the mess we're in.
I'll take Jan, and then I don't know if there's any questions online. I might take one after a couple after this.
Donald Trump.
Can we have a mic here?
He's next. Yeah.
There's one coming. Just wait. We're not building up the tension for this question, by the way.
Thank you. It's not that exciting. Thank you very much. This was really, really fascinating. I was wondering, John, when you showed basically the increase in the correlations with several other factors in the Constitution, like the libertarian authoritarian scale, left, right, and so on, does this come at all at the expense of the factor that around 2014 was the one that beat them all, which was expectations about the economy in an independent Scotland, right? Back then, the correlation was nearly perfect, right? So much that we've all used it in our teaching as like one of the few real-life kind of examples of it. So I'm wondering, is there a minority of people now who basically, despite thinking that, who basically go against the economic evaluation, or are these things entirely aligned with the economic evaluation of independence as well?
That is a fascinating question, John. I can't really analyse it with SSA data, but I could analyse it with other data, and I'll see if I can get around to it. I mean, the difficulty we've got now about the economic question, right, is, of course, the question that Scotland would face now is different from the one it would face in 2014, because it's no longer simply about being inside or outside the UK. It's about being inside or outside the EU. And basically, I mean, I've done this in, well, two points to make. One is that certainly, insofar as there are recent readings in terms of people's perceptions of the economic consequences of independence, they're roughly as on balance as on negative as they were 10 years ago. And they weren't overwhelmingly against, but they were on balance somewhat against. But they're nothing like as against as are people's perceptions of the economic consequences of being outside the EU. And once you start asking people to evaluate being in the EU and outside the UK versus being inside the UK and outside the EU, then being inside the EU tends to win. So part of the answer to you may well be is that because now although people may be doubtful about the consequences of independence, they're even more doubtful about the consequences of the EU, and therefore it's the question of which is the lesser of two evils, is another evil for the afternoon. Is that therefore, yes, it may well be that as a result, some people who are still doubtful about independence will now go with it because they're even more doubtful about Brexit. But I'll try and test that out at some point.
Okay. Questions from online?
Yeah, hi. I've got three here that I'm going to whiz through because I think they'll have quite quick answers. So what influence or impact are we seeing from reform is one question. Then in regards to attitudes towards armed forces, is there any intention to cover that in a future SSA? And if not, why not, given the current geopolitics? And then the third question is, what evidence do we have about attitudes towards other nations in Europe, for instance? That's it.
Do you want to have a go at that first? Have you got any data on some of these things, Elsa?
We've not got attitudes to the army or attitudes to other nations. We are trying to figure out what is going on in terms of in terms of reform support, partly to track where that support is coming from. So we know that the vast majority of it is coming from former Conservative supporters. We know that it is particularly coming from men, and it is particularly coming from those who are older, and it is particularly coming from Leave supporters. So if we're asking about what consequence it's having on reform, what the consequence of reform is having, the most obvious consequence is that it is causing Conservative support to decrease rather rapidly. So that's what we have on that. I mean, we can talk about what opportunities and challenges there are. I mean, I think there are opportunities for reform in Scotland, in that they are arguing that the status quo needs radical change, and I do believe that the Scottish electorate is primed to respond to that argument, having been told that by the SNP for the past however many years. But there are obvious challenges for reform in Scotland as well. So we know in terms of propensity to vote, if we ask people on a 0 to 10 scale, Reform is the party that now has the highest proportion of any party saying 0 out of 10, I will never vote for that party. So that's an obvious ceiling effect for them. We know that their leader is the least popular party leader the only less popular one is Donald Trump, but he's not standing here. So the only UK leader he is the UK leader with the lowest rating. So that's also a constraint on their support. And we also know that they are perceived to be a party of a particular form of English grievance, that doesn't always sit easily with Scottish perceptions of where attitudes are. So it's not that their form of grievance is misaligned to values in Scotland, as John has shown. We have Eurosceptics in Scotland. They just vote differently at the ballot box. We have people opposed to immigration. In Scotland, we have people who would place themselves on the right of a left-right spectrum, but that's not necessarily how people see themselves. And so therefore, that is in itself also a constraint on reform support. To the questions about armed forces and other nations, the short answer is that British social attitudes has
got into this territory. They are, of course, reserved matters, so raising the funds to do this north of the border, but if anybody wishes to offer, the begging bowl will be happily put in front of you. So it does make it more difficult to raise the money to cover these topics north of the border. I mean, on the impact of reform, I mean, SSA 24, having been done last autumn, it basically predates the post-election rise of reform. You can use it to look at the people who voted for reform in the general election. Again, we've done that with the British data. You can probably assume that we will be very, very interested in taking the data that's currently in the field, both north and south of the border, and again trying to paint a wider picture about what distinguishes reform supporters from other supporters, what do they believe in, etc., etc. So we'll probably get into that. I mean, otherwise, and I'll now go back to Rachel's question, which I deliberately ignored. But as we're getting towards the end of the afternoon, we'll relax the rules a bit. I mean, the impact of reform in Scotland. Well, I mean, the principal impact, I would say, is it's paved the way for John Swinney to have a fairly clear path to remaining as First Minister, because the support for reform has come virtually none of it's coming from the SNP. It's coming from the Conservatives. It's coming more from Labour north of the border than it is south of the border, because Labour's vote north of the border is less left-wing than it is south of the border. So therefore, it's fragmented the Unionist vote. It leaves the SNP, whose support is barely any higher than it was in last year, now well ahead of everybody else. And the point is, in the first past the post element of Holyrood, which is 73 out of the 129 seats, the SNP, if things remain as they are going to pick up the vast bulk of the first past the post seats. They will be significantly overrepresented, but there won't be enough PR seats to correct the disproportionality. In much the same way as the rise of reform last year paved the way to Labour's substantial overall majority, at the moment it potentially paves the way towards John Swinney being able to be relatively unchallenged as First Minister. That said, I think probably looking at a Scottish Parliament that is going to be more fragmented. I suspect the SNP will be a smaller parliamentary majority than it is at the moment. And it's probably going to be quite a difficult parliament to manage even without reform. Labour won't want to be able to support the SNP. Labour won't, no government will want, no party will want to be seen to be supping with reform, etc., etc. And to that extent, at least, basically, we're probably going to be talking a parliament in which the government is playing an eternal game of footsie with the Greens and the Democrats as being the only two parties, neither of whom may be that large to try to take them over the line to get legislation through the parliament.
There was a visual image that none of us wanted. Okay, any more questions in the room? Yeah, one down here and then one after. Just here.
Hello, thank you very much. That was very, very good. I really enjoyed that. My question is to all three of you. Did you cover anything in the surveys about trust and the anger and rage of the Scottish population and the British population in terms of whether they trust the government, whether they trust businesses, especially the large businesses like Amazon, where they are, their profit margins are so massive and they're not looking after their staff properly, and so the staff are suffering and the consumers, the service level is very, very low. Because I've seen and I've heard the presentation in the US where they talked about it, and it was just, to me, when they were presenting it, it was like replicated what we have experienced in the UK. Is that something that has been covered by yourselves?
The last part specifically, no, though I suspect somewhere or other I could find in the 40-odd years of British social attitudes data the odd question on attitudes towards big business. But again, it's not something that has a particularly Scottish angle to it, so therefore it tends not to arise on SSA. Yes, you're kind of tempting me to write a letter to Amazon and say, would you like some work on what do people think of these behemoths who are now supplying our day, and see if I can get away with it or not. So, I mean, I think the thing that's nearest to what you are interested in are these questions. And these are questions that were developed in the 1980s, which just tried to get more broadly people's attitudes towards inequality. But there isn't anything particularly on attitudes towards business. Well, there is. I mean, British social attitude, well, both in their variety of different ways, both British and Scottish social attitudes have indeed, asked questions about trust, and some of it again is some of the publicity surrounding this survey. I mean, to put not too fine a point on it, we are talking about a society north and south of the border that is deeply pessimistic, and there is a substantial crisis of confidence about the ability of the state to solve the economic and public services problems, let alone the gap between reality and rhetoric and reality on immigration at all. And that this is undoubtedly one of the things that's helping to fuel support. People who support reform are the folk who really don't think that either Labour or the Conservatives, again, this is British data, are able to deal with those three issues. So, and you can show how, particularly with British data, but again, there are hints of it in the Scottish data, as to how people who are economically struggling and people who are unhappy about the state of the health service, these are things that also undermine trust and confidence in government. It's not just whether or not, the Deputy Prime Minister pays her due taxes or not. It is actually to do with substance as well, not just ethics.
On anger, from the Union survey, so we polled in Scotland, England, Northern Ireland and Wales, we know that the English electorate is angrier than the Scottish electorate. For us, we see a relationship to a sense of efficacy, but also nostalgia. So the Scottish electorate is less nostalgic than the English electorate. The least nostalgic are Northern Ireland, for obvious reasons, I would think. But in England, we see a relationship between anger, nostalgia, English national identity, and then the two unions, so Euroscepticism, but also a kind of sense of Devo anxiety. So we find that in those data. On trust, in the Scottish election study, we're always interested in how do people in Scotland navigate the multi-level worlds that they exist in. And for us, trust is also something that can be developed in a multi-level way. So your generalized trust can be built by your trust in Scottish institutions and by UK institutions. So we ran an experiment after Partygate to see whether there would be spillover effects. Are people less trusting of different political actors as a result of Partygate? And can we see a difference in the effect for British political actors and Scottish political actors? And there, in fact, we found not a contagion effect, so decreased trust as a result of Boris Johnson's parties in British political actors and Scottish political actors. It wasn't a contagion effect. It was a boomerang effect. People became less trusting in British political actors, but more trusting in Scottish political actors as a result of that. We tried to replicate it with Campervan Gate to see if it would have the opposite effect, and it didn't. It's a much less evocative scandal as far as trust is concerned at a multi-level. Right, but you wanted to talk about that one as well.
Yeah, really just to add briefly to what John said, that we have had some questions on trust towards big businesses over the years that you'd potentially be able to find on the UKDS. In addition to that, possibly there's some on the International Social Survey programme that we've had over the years that capture some of those attitudes as well. But it's something I think should certainly be further explored.
Okay, in the interest of time, I'm afraid, sorry, I'm going to start drawing proceedings to an end to keep us keen and get us onto the networking refreshment. So if you do have additional questions, then please join us upstairs. And it also means that I don't get to ask my own question, which was really about, and don't answer it just now, think about it. I just had a wonder, and you didn't present the slide, John, but support for independence amongst the younger age group appears to be dropping a little in recent years.
The age gap.
No, you don't. No, you're not allowed to answer, right? Because we're running out of time. Just think about it, and then we can talk about it upstairs. I just wonder the significance of what we're seeing is some significance of the independence and Brexit referendum on people's attitudes, behaviours, constitutional preferences. Are we just going to see some cohort effects? You know, as we move away from these really significant events, will they start to have less impact because we have younger voters coming through who have not been through that? He's screwing his face up. Probably not is the quick answer. Anyway, so thank you very much to lots of people for this afternoon. Thanks, first of all, to Sophie and John for producing the report that we've shared with you today.
I should say, by the way, none of this would have happened. I mean, Elsa wanted more. There would have been zero, but for Sophie doing an awful lot of very, as you can imagine, with 25 years of data, it's not always exactly in the same place, or, you know, you need to know this little bit, you need to know that little bit about where to find variables, etc. And it was a very, very substantial challenge, and I'm really, really grateful to her for the very, very substantial work that she engaged in order to be able to do that.
Yeah, thank you, Sophie. Thanks also to Ailsa and Lucy for their reflections for this afternoon. Quick thanks to our marketing communications team for organising affairs this afternoon, and thanks to all of you, our audience in person and online, for engaging so deeply with the issues that we talked about today. And please, join us upstairs for some refreshments if you're able to hang around. Thank you all.